a watercolor to help you show how to produce the look of glass and shine. We're using canned tomatoes for number one, because of the season of tomatoes, and number two, because it's a great subject for the glass. It'll show us exactly what we want to do. I did use some masking agent and masked out some of the seeds that you would see. But if you don't have masking fluid, you can put that on later. You don't have to worry about that. You're going to be using cadmium red tonight. You'll be using a little bit of yellow. You'll be using a little bit of yellow ochre, some burnt umber, brown, a little bit of turquoise, and some black. We're going to start off with a little bit of turquoise because that is just the color of some glass, and I want to make it a little bit visible. So I'm finding the glass parts of the jar that are not covered with tomato or lid. So I'm going to just put a very pale wash of turquoise on my jars where the glass would be that is not covered by tomatoes or by the lid. It's very pale. I don't want it to be very, very intense in color because it's going to be covered anyway. We're going to be covering it with some shadowing, and we're going to be covering some of it with some tomato color. So I am just putting in where my glass has nothing below it or above it. And it's very pale. I don't want a lot of color on this. When we do our tomato color, now tomatoes can be just plain cad red. However, they may have a tendency then to be too intensely red. We don't want them to be too intensely red because actually the canned tomatoes tend to be like a rusty color, not so much, your bright red color. So we're going to be mixing some of our cadmium red with a little bit of burnt umber, which is our brown color, because we want to get that little bit of a rust color. Doesn't mean that we want them to be brown looking. We certainly don't want them to look spoiled, but we also don't want them to be too intensely red. So I'm putting some brown, some burnt umber in with my red. And I'm going to use my nice big brush. And I'm going to get that color on there. It's okay if it bleeds slightly onto my jar color, because all that will do is make it look as if my tomatoes have foamed a little bit on the surface. Nice and wet. You want your coloring to be nice and wet. That's what watercolor is. And that's how you will get your best results if you are nice and wet with your color. Now I'm going to spend most of my time doing one complete jar other than the highlighting, because I want to be able, for the time frame, to get everything in there. And I don't want to run out of time. So I'm going to do one complete jar, and then we will go back and we will do the others. Each jar is done the same. There's really no difference in how they are done. So I have my tomato jar filled with my tomato color. And my tomato color again is some cadmium red and some burnt umber, which is the brown. And you see how nice and wet I am. I'm nice and wet. And because I'm nice and wet, I get a nice smooth surface. And I can go back in and I'm still so nice and wet that I don't cause double exposure with my paint because I'm so nice and wet. It just has a nice soft blend to it, which is exactly what you want. So I have my first jar filled with my tomatoes. Now, this is the point where if you want to change up your color a little bit and you want to maybe add a little bit of extra umber here and there, you can go ahead and do that. And as long as you're nice and wet, those colors will soften themselves and you will still have that nice soft blend. You may want to try to put in a little bit of alizarin crimson, which is a pinkish tone, if you want to do that, or even adding a tiny little bit of yellow so that you get an orangey tone. I'll put in a little bit of yellow here, mixing it with my red, but I get like a little bit of an orangey color. And I don't want too many colors. I don't want this to be like the jar of many colors here, but you can see how you'll have some different colors. It just adds to the excitement going on in your jar there. We're going to move up to the metal now. And the metal lid, I'm going to be using yellow ochre on. Yellow ochre is like a very dirty looking yellow. It's more of a goldish yellow, but that's exactly what I want for my lid. And I'm going to add a little bit of umber to that also, just to tone it down even more. And I'm going to paint the entire lid. Now you can see why I don't tape my paper down. A lot of people like to tape their papers down, but I don't because I spin mine around too much. And it would be too hard for me to do that. So now I have my lid color, I have my jar color, and I have my tomato color. What I'm going to do is I want to dry all of that really well so that I can go back in now and start to highlight and shadow and put in the detail to my lid. Now I'm going to go back into this section here because obviously you can't just leave it like that. You have to see what is through this glass section because it is glass. So I'm going to use that same red color that I used to paint my tomatoes because behind this and what I would see would be the tomatoes from this jar. So I'm going to just add a little bit of black to that reddish color to tone it down. And I'm going to paint in the glass under here. Now you might be wondering why I added black to that. I added black to that because it's shadowed because of the lid. The lid is shadowing what's underneath it. So I already just added my shadow color to my tomato color. And that's what's going to be under here, at least for now. There's going to be a lot of other little details going on soon. Now I'm going to move up to my lid itself. If you look at your picture, you'll see that your lid both has some shadowing and it also has some indentations in the lid. And those indentations pick up your shadows and they pick up highlights. So we're going to do both. I'm using a much smaller brush now. And I'm going to use my black for my shadowing. And my light source is coming from this direction. So my shadowing is going to be on this side of the jars, which would be on the right side of the jar. So I'm going to go ahead and shadow the two sections. That are sticking out the most. I'm going to leave a little rim, not shadowed, because that's where the light is being picked up. And I'm going to dry brush the edge off. Dry brushing is just when you lay your brush on its side and you drag that paint across your lid. That will give it a nice rough edge, but that rough edge just adds to how the light is picking up on the jar lid. I'm going to go up and the inner rim, the inner lid, not the rim, but the actual lid. I'm going to paint that in with some shadowed color. And that's just to help to show the difference here between the rim and the lid. See how that's already looking like a great lid to me. I'm going to go in now to this section that we painted, and I'm going to add a little bit of shadow along the edge of the rim, because it's kind of overhanging onto the glass. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to do some of that dry brushing, just to get in a little bit of extra color right now. We also need to shadow this side of the jar. So I'm going to put some shadowing along this edge. I'll go back in with my bigger brush now. I'm going to go all along the edge with a little bit of a shadow. And then I'm going to soften that with my brush. I dipped my brush in water, blotted it on a paper towel so that it wouldn't be sopping wet, And then I'm just softening that edge. Okay. That's going to be my initial shadows. There's going to be more shadows as they come. Before I can do much detail though in that lid, I'm going to dry it again. I always have my picture handy too, because I refer to my picture quite often because I can't remember everything there is on this jar, everywhere there might be shadowing or everywhere that there may be something that I might be missing. So I'm going to refer to my picture. My picture tells me that this is the bottom of the rim, of the glass rim. So I am shadowing that because it's overhanging the glass. And then I'm going to dry brush the edge off in places to make it look as if, number one, I have some light texturing in my glass, not a whole bunch, but I do have some texturing in my glass. And that's just going to help to define that. I'm going to go back up to my lid and I'm going to redefine some of these places that I've already painted, and I'm going to do the same thing. I am going to just dry brush, give it a little bit of roughness here and there. Because if you do can and you know what it's like canning, you know that some of these rims, they've gotten their use. So they are not just perfect, especially mine. I use them every year. So, you know, they have a lot of roughness to them. They have a lot of texture to them. Now, you'll also notice that along the top of that rim, it's crimped. So that in order to show that crimping, I'm going to be doing straight black lines along my edge. And as I get towards the light, I'm going to lessen my lines because the shadows will not be as evident as I'm getting towards the light. They're going to be a little bit less. So I am going to lessen the length of those crimped lines along there. I'm going to go back in now and shadow on my tomatoes before I go back up towards my lid. And I'm going to use a very pale watered down black. I don't want it to be too dark because I don't want to cover up my tomatoes. I just want to shadow them slightly. So again, if you look at your picture, you will see some shadowing on the jar. The jar is not so much shadowed as it is reflective, and it's reflecting the images in the room or what's in front of it or me, whatever, but it's reflecting that in the jar. So if you look at your jar, you see shapes. I see a straight shape It kind of comes down, odd shaped. There's some straight up and down lines. And again, this is what I see. You may not see what I see. You know that game, do you see what I see? Well, maybe you don't see exactly what I see, and that is okay. But these are the shapes that I see. So that's what I'm putting in my jar. Just helps to make it look a little bit more interesting. And our highlighting is going to go on top of that shadowing. I also see a little bit of a deeper shadow along my edge again. And then that shadow kind of extends itself along the bottom. This is not the shadow on the table. This is strictly the shadow in my tomatoes. And again, it's not really a shadow, it is a reflection. Going to go back up here to right under my rim again. So right under my rim, I have a nice dark shadow on the glass. So I'm putting that nice dark shadow in right along the rim of that metal lid. Starting to really look like a jar of tomatoes. I'm going to dry it one more time. I don't want to overdo. The more you do, the more that you have an opportunity to create a mud color on your tomatoes. You don't want to do that. You want to keep your nice vibrant reds. You want to keep your reflective color. Even if you're looking at this now and you're thinking, it just doesn't look like that glass. It's not going to look like glass until we put our white highlight on. When we put our white highlight on, I guarantee you, not many people will guarantee, I guarantee you, you are going to say, wow. Because it is so obvious with that highlight. The glass is so obvious. You can't help but just be in awe of how it works. When we use white, we have to make sure everything is dry. Nothing can be painted on top of your white. So you want to make sure you're happy with everything before you add any highlighting. We have to paint in our seeds because we're not going to be able to go back over that when we start to put our highlight on. So I'm going to give it one last really good dry. I'm going to take off my biscuit for my seeds. I'm going to paint those with a yellow ochre color, but with a little bit of red added to it. And then we will put our highlight on. Okay, I'll say this one more time, just so that you know, you cannot put your white highlights on unless you are totally happy, because once you put them on, you cannot put another color over your whites. So you want to make sure that you're happy with everything. Do you want to add anything? If you do, now's the time to do it. Just for the sake of adding something, I'll put on a little bit more red up here. I'll put on a little bit, maybe more kind of going up the center. And then I will just blend that off with a little bit of water in my brush so that I don't have a nice hard line. But even if you did, that would be okay, because it would be something that might just be reflective in your jar. If you wanted to add more of a reflection with your black, now is the time to do it. So say I wanted to add just a little bit more down at the bottom or wherever. Now is when you want to put that in. And you can refer to your picture for this, or you can just do it wherever you feel that you need to have something. Maybe you have an area in your jar that's very, very plain. There's nothing there. It just looks like it needs a little bit more to it. Then go ahead and do it. I'm going to add a little bit more of my red color up in here. This is my plain clear jar, but what it is seeing behind it is more tomatoes. So I'm just going to add a little bit right along that edge, just as if it's seeing through to tomatoes in this jar or this jar or this jar. Okay, one last time, I will go ahead and dry it, and then we're going to put on our white. When we put on our white, if you've seen any of the other videos, you know I always use a separate container for my white, because I don't want to contaminate it with other colors, and I don't want to contaminate my other colors with the white, because if white would get mixed in with your other paints, because it's an opaque paint, it will permanently damage the paint that's in your palette. So you want to try to keep those separately. I'm going to take off my misket where my tomato seeds are. It just rubs off with your finger. If it doesn't, there's always the possibility that your misket is old, because misket does get too old. And if you're having trouble taking your misket off, you need to get new, because it could damage your paper. Okay, so I took my misket off. Now I'm going to paint in my seeds with a little bit of yellow ochre, but I'm mixing that yellow ochre with a little bit of the cad red that I used, because these seeds being in this jar, they are not going to be, perfectly scene, especially if your jar might have a little bit of an aqua tint to it or whatever. So I'm just painting these in. I want them to be visible, but I don't want them to overtake and draw your eye towards them. So this is a little bit of cad yellow with the tomato color. You can still see that there's some seeds in the jar, but they're just not standing out and they don't draw attention to just the seed. Now, when I put my white on, my Chinese white, when you put Chinese white on, you can put it on very lightly by watering it down, and then it'll be very transparent. Or you can put it on a little bit thicker, and then it becomes the really white highlight. So we're going to do the transparent white first. And that simply means that it's going to have a little bit of a sheen, look like a little bit of a light sheen on my jar, but it's not going to have that wow white spotting. That will come next. So I'm going to make sure my seeds are dry. When you are using white, you always want to make sure you use clean water. Don't use your dirty water from your tomatoes because you will automatically contaminate your white. So you want to make sure you're using clean water and make sure your brush is nice and clean. And I'm going to start with my whitewash along the bottom. As I said before, if you make your white nice and watery, it's going to dry very transparent. Okay, so I'm going to go along the edge of my jar. And I am not just guessing where this is. I am actually using my picture, and where I see my white, that is where I'm putting it on. When you are using your white, you want to do it in as few strokes as possible because you don't want to mix your white. You want your white just to go over the color that is there. So you don't want to go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, because what will happen is you'll turn it to pink. We don't want pink. We want white. So you want to do it in as few strokes as possible. And I'm just picking up on what designs I see in my jar, in my jar that looks like where the light is shining. They're just shapes. But those shapes are helping to create the shape of my jar and what highlighting the jar is seeing. Might not be anything much, but just these simple shapes that you're putting in help to create the shape, help to create where the the jar is bent where it's folded. Now I'll revert to a smaller brush. I'm going to go along my glass in here. I'm going to do a little bit of dry brushing. Look how that highlight just looks like it's being picked up along the edge of that glass. Isn't that cool? I mean, this to me is the wow moment. I'm going to go, I'm going to paint some shapes in that I see in my glass. Doesn't mean we all see the exact same shapes, but this is what I see. And then I'm going to go up to my lid because I have some areas of my lid that are not really intensely highlighted. There's a little bit of a highlight on those. So I'm going to just do that. And then I'm going to get my smaller brush and I'm going to get into my really intense white lines. This is where the light is shining along a rim or along an edge, and it's picking up all of that really highlighted white, the bright white. I'm going to go in between some of my little rim lines with my light. And I will add the area where the direct light is actually hitting my rim now. This is where that bright light hits that rim like sunshine on metal. And then last but not least, the couple little spots where it's shining not on the metal, but now it's shining on the actual glass. Isn't that great? Look how that glass just popped right out. And it's only because of that little bit of white that we put on. So now we're going to do a second one. It's going to be done exactly like this first one, but I'll talk you through this one also. We're going to do our red tomato color first, which is our cad red, mixed with a little bit of umber. Use your nice big brush there so that you can get it done in just a couple swipes of the brush. Again, when you are working with watercolor, it is watercolor. So you want to be nice and watery. You want to be nice and wet because your paint will work because it's following your water line. And if you don't allow it water, it has nowhere to go. So you want to be nice and wet. Even if you have to go back in and dip into your paint a couple times, that's perfectly fine. But you want to be nice and wet. Don't try to stretch your paint. Go back in and get more paint on your brush. We've already done our plain glass. So now while we're waiting for our tomato color to dry, before it dries, you want to again go back in and change up that color a little bit. Maybe add in a little bit of burnt umber. You could put in a little bit of your yellow mixed with your red color to give it a little bit of an orangey color. You want subtle changes though. You don't want anything crazy. You don't want spots of yellow, but you can put in some different coloring, slight coloring. And while that's drying, we're going to go up and we're going to put a wash of yellow ochre mixed with a little bit of umber on the lid. We're going to paint that whole lid. Okay, we're going to dry it. Look at the difference between this and this. You started out like this, but look what you created, just with two different colors. This became this with just shadowing and highlighting. Amazing. Okay, I'm going to change up my color slightly. I'm going to add a little bit more red on this here. And then I will rinse my brush, tap it off on a paper towel so that it's not sopping wet, and I'll soften those edges a little bit. I'm going to use that same color because we want to fill this glass in, because behind this is still more jars of tomatoes. So I'm going to fill that in with my tomato color, not as intense as my jar, because it is more the reflection or the what I see through the glass now, but I still want to add some color in that. And you might be questioning too, why did you put turquoise on first? Just because that is the color of some jars. If you wanted to leave it plain, you certainly could do that too. But I wanted to kind of have that little bit of a turquoisey color come through. Doesn't mean that you have to, but that's just personal preference. So now I have my color here. While I'm waiting for that to dry, I can go ahead and even start to put in some of my black into my lid. Again, your light source is here, so this has to be shadowed over here. So I'm going to pick up my shadow right along this edge. Doing the same thing I did on this one. I'm going to go ahead and let that bleed onto my glass. That'll just add to my shadow. I'm going to fill in along the top. I'm going to re-dry my tomatoes because I want to put a little bit of a shadow. Remember, mainly your shadow would have been about over to here, but you'll still have a little bit right here that you can add, and that'll help to separate those jars out a little bit better. So I'm going to go ahead and dry it. to do the same thing. What do I see on that glass that is a little bit darker? It's the reflections of something. So I'm going to go along the bottom here. This is what I am seeing in that glass. And I'm referring to my picture. That's why the pictures are so important. If you don't want to use a picture, that is perfectly fine. I mean, sometimes people just like to paint from memory or, paint what they think it's going to look like. That is perfectly fine. I just like to use a photo. I've always used a photo. That's how I do my thing. Does not mean that I am right and you are wrong. I'm going to go back into, this is the clear part of the glass. I'm going to start to add a little bit of roughness in there. These are actual rounded rim parts. So they're creating a little bit of a shadow or a little bit of like an overhang. So that's why I'm putting these colors in, the darker colors, because it's creating that overhang. Okay, I'm going to dry it one more time and then I'll start to do my real detail with my black along the edge there. Okay, where do I see my darkest shadows? I see a nice dark shadow right here along the edge of my glass. And then I see it come along my tomatoes. All along the edge here. And I'm softening it just with a little bit of water. Now, this jar has some writing on it in the glass. So of course you can't see it because it's transparent, but because it is sticking out, it's causing a little bit of a shadow from the B for ball on that glass. So I'm putting in that little bit of a shadow, and then that's going to help me to show you where the highlight's going to go. Okay, so I have my dark colors in that I wanted first. You want to get your dark in first, of course, because you can't put highlights on anything over your highlights. So you want that to be done first. You want to make sure that you get all of those colors that you need to get in there. If you need to add a little bit more red, add a little bit more of your umber, whatever colors you want in there, you want to get in there before you add any of your white highlighting. So I'm putting in my last little bit of my darker colors. I'm going to go in with my little brush, and I'm going to add those little nubs along the rim, those little crinkle spots. And as I get closer to the left, where the light source would be, I'm going to get smaller, shorter. Okay, I'm happy with that. So I'm going to go and I'm going to start with my white. Again, clean water. You want to make sure you have clean water. I always have extra clean water around. And I'm going to start with my bigger brush first and put in where I see some of my bigger white areas. Again, I am referring to my picture, what I see in my picture, where I see that white. Oops, forgot to color my seeds. I have to stop and get my seeds colored. Getting so anxious to get my white highlights on there, forgot my seeds. There's a couple seeds under my white highlights I'll deal with later. Same thing, you're gonna use a little bit of that yellow color with a little bit of your tomato color. You don't want your seeds to be the center of attention. Okay, I'll go ahead and dry those really well. Okay, now we can do that again. We can go back in, get our nice white highlights on there. It's amazing what you will see in a picture when you're really looking for something. Otherwise, you would never even give it a second, glance. But when you are really looking for things, it's just amazing what you do see. Getting my smaller brush now. Now I'm going to show you a little trick on highlighting your lettering. So you don't want to have to make a mistake once you've gotten this far and mess up your jars because you screwed up your lettering. So what I do is I am just going to use plain water, and I'm going to paint my letter on so that I can see it. And you'll be able to see it in the water. Okay. Now, because you can see it in the water, you can see your lines that you did in water. It's going to be a lot easier to go along the edge of some of that lettering in your water and put on that little bit of highlighting that will be picked up from the way that your lettering sticks out, and it causes the light to catch on to that highlighted area. So I am just doing some, I'm not doing all of it, because I just want to give that impression of a ball jar. Okay. You can also do, if there's some other little, lettering along the bottom. I'll do Mason since it's my last name anyway. Same thing, I'm just going to add that little bit of white along. Doesn't get the full effect, but you get the idea, okay? Now, last but not least on this jar, there's nice intense spots. Make sure your whites are really white. If they have dried and they are almost transparent, you can go over them again. That's no problem. If you want to add a couple that, you feel that you need a couple more, even if it's not in the picture or whatever, but you want to add a couple more, nobody says you can't. It's your picture. You can do whatever you want with it. Now, we're going to still do another lid at least, but I want to add my shadow on the bottom. It's just on a white table, so I'm just going to add a nice hard shadow under my jars, and that will at least complete the jar part here. So let's get some nice black for my dark shadow. I'm going to do this one first. And just very lightly with a bigger brush, I'm going to wet the edge just slightly. I'm going to rinse my brush, dab it off on a paper towel, and just run that along the edge. And that's going to soften that ever so slightly. So I have that nice shadow under there. One more to go. Guess I should use my bigger brush there. Same thing. Rinse my brush really well. Dab it off on a paper towel. And just go along my edge ever so slightly. Just to soften it just a bit. Now, if that doesn't look real, I don't know what does. I'm gonna do one more lid back here. This jar, you would do exactly the same as this one. Lids all the same, but we'll go ahead and do one more lid just because we have some time. We still good on time, Mark?
Yes, we have about 15 minutes.
Okay, good. Okay, so we're gonna do one more lid. This is certainly something that you would be able to finish at home, even if you had 15 jars in your picture, because they are all done exactly the same way. Lids are all done the same way. Your light source is all from the same direction. Your shadow is all from the same direction. So everything is just repetitive. We could have, or you could have, done all of your red, all of your tomatoes first. And to put my tomatoes in this jar, I'm drying it. I'm putting my tomatoes in this jar, I'm drying it. I'm putting my tomatoes in this jar, I'm drying it. Then I'm gonna go and do lid, 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 lid. It's personal preference, however you wanted to do it. But because we have a little bit of a time constraint tonight, I wanted you to see a full jar so that you would know exactly what to do. So let's dry this lid. Okay, I'm going to put my shadows in. My shadows, of course, come from over here. Paint in my lid at the top. Dry that a little bit before I get into detail. Nice and dark with your lines. Change this one up just a little bit. Give this one a little bit more color. Dry it, add the highlights on that one. When you would do the tomatoes in this jar, because this jar is way to the edge on the left, you wouldn't be worried about shadowing that. You would only be shadowing the jar way over here. So because this one is nice and shadowed though, I'm going to put a wash on there for you to show you. It'll stand out from the other one nice because this one is already shadowed. Okay, so let's put this, we have a few more minutes. Let's put this tomato together here, this tomato jar. You see how nice that'll stand out from that other jar because this one's already shadowed. Okay, very little space for that one. So it's really not that imperative that you would change up too much of the color. But if you want to, you can put a couple lines of your umber or your black in to change that up. Another little line over here because the tomatoes will be over here. So we might as well just do that now too. And then all you're going to be left with is a couple rims. The rest of your background is filled in with some dark color. I would just use your black for that. Nothing else below the jars. It's a white table, so we're going to leave it white. Besides, I like how nice that the shadow under the jar stands out then again against that white. And then you will have another completed picture. We're just moving and grooving here. We do have one more live Zoom painting class in September. And of course, these are all videoed, so you can go back and watch it as many times as you want. If you missed something or if something you forgot something, you can go back in and rewatch it. But everything is, is videoed for you. And this is your finished picture. Once you get those last couple lids in, you are good to go. Looks great.